it is absolutely true today that most mobile devices are based on Linux. And personally, I'm intrigued by Nokia's recent announcement. I don't understand it. I won't say any more about it. But I believe that as we roll forward, there will be mobile devices based on Linux, and there will be the ones we no longer care about. That's a reasonably bold assertion to make, but I think it's absolutely true because I believe there's a strong evolutionary advantage in this ecosystem. And while it is currently facing, and will continue to face, challenges from various quarters, to me that's just evidence of the fact that things are going well, that there's a lot of success, and that people are getting concerned about that success. And I'll point out for those of you who don't realize it, that Android is not the only mobile operating system that's based on Linux. You know, when HP acquired Palm a year or so ago, the reason we did that was an intense interest in the potential of WebOS, which happens to be a Linux-based mobile operating system. If you hadn't realized that already, that's another one to pay attention to. While I agree that MeeGo has been sort of interesting to watch, and from the first moment that the potential marriage of the Moblin and MIMO communities was discussed with the Linux Foundation Board of Directors, I've had my concerns about how this is all going to play out. But there is enough investment, particularly by Intel, and enough enthusiasm from various hardware developers in Asia around MeeGo that I do believe in 2011 we will see some MeeGo-based products entering the marketplace. I don't know whether we'll see a significant play in the phone space, but I would not be surprised to see it show up in places like in-vehicle information systems and things like that. Time will tell. It's always hard to know before things actually hit the market what's going to make it all the way to market and what isn't. But I think the future for Linux-embedded devices, particularly in the mobile space, is intensely strong, and as a consequence, I see nothing but sort of positives for the future of Linux in the large. You know, will the vast majority of people someday end up thinking of Linux as the most important piece of software in their life? I really doubt it. And the reason is that if we are successful at doing all the things we've set out to do, they just won't think about it because it'll just work and it will be the basis of products that define consumer experiences that are compelling independent of what that underlying technology is. And people will think about how great their, widget 2012 is and not how wonderful Linux is. And that's perfectly okay. In the end, I think we'll all be happy with what comes. Okay, so this is all about sort of client devices, right? I mean, whether it's a television or whether it's a microwave oven or whether it's the in-dash navigation system in your car or whether it's a phone, that's all sort of, client computing type devices. A few years ago, Eben Moglen observed in a speech that he gave at Harvard Law School that we now had a body of software accessible to everyone on Earth so robust and so profound in its possibilities that we were a few months away from doing whatever it is that anybody wanted to do with computers all the time. When I read that, I just sort of took a deep breath and said, yeah, right. And for people like me, the challenge since then has been figuring out what are the interesting things that we ought to do. How should we apply this technology? Where is the right place to use open source? How do we balance large corporate investments like mine, like Bob's at IBM, in proprietary software with a growing interest in participating, collaborating in, and taking benefit from the open source ecosystem? And that really has been, what a lot of the thinking has been about. Well, Eben's somebody that I've known for a long time, and he recently helped point out to many of us in the free software development world that there were other things that we could do and probably should do. And one of those is epitomized by the creation of this thing called the Freedom Box Foundation. Out of curiosity, how many of you have heard of the Freedom Box Foundation? Wow, that's really cool. Did any of you actually contribute to the Kickstarter fundraising campaign? No? Okay, well, it's okay. What is a Freedom Box? A Freedom Box, if we had slightly better connections here, I'd be tempted to show you the video from CBS News from a couple of weeks ago when they interviewed Eben and talked about this. But the idea is that a Freedom Box is a personal server running a free software operating system and applications that are designed to create and preserve personal privacy. What does that mean? Well, Zonker talked about it a little bit this morning. We live in a world today where an awful lot of how we think about each other and how we collaborate and communicate is done through these things we call social networking sites. You know, Facebook, Twitter, using Flickr to share photos, all sorts of things like this. MySpace, I guess, if people still use that. I know in Brazil, Orkut is still hugely popular. There are a lot of these social networking sites around the world. Certainly Facebook is by far the most prominent. What's the problem with that? The problem with it is that every time you upload something into one of these sites, you are basically giving up some element of control of that object. Maybe that doesn't matter to you. I certainly, when I upload launch photos of my rockets to Flickr to share with friends, I'm happy to let them eat the outbound bandwidth so that it doesn't soak my little thin connection into my house to share those photos with my friends, and I don't feel terribly proprietary about them. In fact, I'd love for lots of people to look at my launch photos and go, ooh, shiny. But there's an awful lot of information being shared in these social networks that the idea that somebody else has the ability to read it or might end up in control of that data sometime is downright frightening. So what we intend to do in the Freedom Box Foundation is to deliver privacy-respecting, federated alternatives to these contemporary social networks that can run on cheap plug computers that individuals can buy and run in their own homes. In their own homes is important because not just in the US, but in many other jurisdictions around the world, there's a fundamental legal distinction between things that belong to you that are in your house and what it takes for somebody to come in and search and seize those versus things that you carry around with you on your person when you're going through airport security or stuff like that. One of the technical elements that we hope to work on quite a bit in the future is mesh networking. This is this notion that devices with wireless interfaces can find each other and create ad hoc networks of connection through which communications can occur without a structured infrastructure already in place. This could be used to augment existing communications infrastructure. One example that people love to use is if you're having a net neutrality problem, if the ISP that you subscribe to won't allow you to talk to some particular site, but your neighbor's using DSL instead of cable modem or vice versa, and they can get to that site, why not have your box just sort of route you over and borrow some of their bandwidth, and on another day when their ISP's down, they'll route through you, and you all sort of collaborate and share the bandwidth that you have access to. And this would be an interesting way to get around some of these net neutrality questions that are being raised. It also has the potential, though, in times of natural disaster, see also Japan at the moment, or in times of political unrest, see also countries in the Middle East at the moment, to help create a communications infrastructure in places where nothing's working. And as a consequence, this could facilitate collaborating safely and securely with others in building social networks of protest, demonstration, and mobilization for political change. These are strange things to talk about when you live in a place like the United States. We like to think of ourselves as being the sort of country and society where this stuff isn't terribly necessary on a day-to-day basis. I would argue, though, that we're seeing instance proofs all around the world, and if we dig back in our own history far enough, we'll be reminded of why it's useful at times to have the ability to collaborate and communicate independently. Personally, this is an interesting technical challenge, and there are a lot of unanswered questions between here and the completion of a stack to accomplish these objectives. The most interesting reason for talking about it in this context, though, is that the Freedom Box is being built as a derivative of Debian. And the reason for doing that, as I've already mentioned, is that Debian is an interesting kind of distribution in that it's not backed by a company, it's a completely open volunteer organization that from the beginning has had a very intense focus on freedom. In fact, it was the creation of this thing called the Debian Social Contract, which made a commitment that all the software in the distribution would be free, that forced the Debian community to have to come up with a definition of what it meant for software to be free, which we call the Debian Free Software Guidelines, which then got picked up and instantly became the acceptance criteria for software to be uploaded to old major distribution sites like SunSite back in the day, and which was copied and tweaked slightly to become this thing we now call the open source definition, which is used as the litmus test for deciding whether some new open source license is actually open source or not. So the Debian distribution has this long history of engagement in this process of trying to understand what freedom means and to try and ensure that the free software that's part of the distribution remains free and can be used for all purposes. It's a very strong technical infrastructure. As I've already mentioned, it's the root of a very rich ecosystem of derivatives. Another thing that's important is it's very international. The last time I checked, there are somewhere between 300 and 400 full mirrors of the Debian distribution around the world. It's a lot of copies of those bits spread out. Make it very difficult to attack, makes it very difficult to kill. The fact that there's no company there gives you an interestingly different kind of assurance about potential longevity. And it's sort of become a truism that because of the inclusive nature of the Debian distribution, the fact that anybody who's interested can join the project and participate in contributing software, that all free software eventually ends up being packaged for Debian. And if that work's going to already be done by somebody anyway, why wouldn't you want to take advantage of it? So with that, I've more or less run out of time. I want to leave you with a thought that's one that I have been articulating for several years about the Linux and open source community in general, and which I think is going to get reinvigorated and reused as we move into this Freedom Box Foundation collaborative evolution of an interesting sort of personal server object thing going forward. And that's this quote from Margaret Mead, that you should never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, because indeed it's the only thing that ever has. With that, I thank you for your time and attention. I don't know if we have any time for questions or not.